Et du coup, je vais vous présenter brièvement Chad Elwell, encore un des deux Américains qui a fait le trajet au travers de l'Atlantique, qui n'a pas désisté pour notre colloque et qui est là donc en présence. Et du coup, alors, Chad Elwell, il a bossé comme ingénieur avant de recevoir son degré de master dans l'enseignement de l'éducation. Il a enseigné les mathématiques et la physique, et maintenant il travaille dans une école secondaire dans le banlieue de Chicago. Et avant cela, il a bossé 6 ans en Autriche dans une école internationale. So, for those of you who speak English, I will let you read Chad's biography here. And with that, I will hand it over to him. And here we go.
Bonjour, je voudrais essayer un expériment, mais je suis désolé, je ne peux pas faire toute la présentation en français, so now I'll switch to English. I would like to begin with an experiment and would eagerly request your participation, if you would indulge me. If one of you would be so kind as to give me a number between 2 and 6 of your choice.
1.
I heard 5 first, so I'll take 5. And if perhaps a different person would be so kind as to volunteer their favorite geometric shape.
Triangle.
Triangle, okay. So we have 5, we have triangle. Let's begin with that. Was it a particular kind of triangle? Was it a particular kind of triangle? I might choose for you.
Free reign. Pas grand-chose.
So we have 5, we have triangles, and I'll pick the number 12. And my question is, what would the blue area here, the area of that region, what would the blue area be? And the truth is I don't know the answer. I'm not certain the answer can be arrived at. But if we were going to attack that problem together, what would be the first step? You'll forgive me for forcing something that some of you haven't studied since high school. You'll forgive me for dredging up perhaps bad memories from years ago. But what would be the first step if we were trying to solve and find that area? Or barring that, what would be a step we could make towards
subtracting some of the other areas that you
subtracting? Okay, so like what? Say.
so you subtract the triangles. I'm assuming maybe if you know the length of each side, you can figure out those, subtract the half area below.
So begin with the triangle areas, perhaps, and subtract them from the whole circle. So area of a circle minus area of some triangles. Sounds like a good start. Past that, what else? The whole area, take away the triangles. Other suggestions? I imagine we can all agree that this is also 12. Now when I asked Jacob for a suggestion, he said triangles. He didn't say which kind of triangle. It looks like these are equilateral, so I suppose we can assume, okay, the triangles have equal sides and go with that. It might get us somewhere. I suppose one of you can recall for me the formula for a circle's area.
If you calculate the surface of a circle, you take the half of it and you take off the free triangle.
So take away the half circle as well.
Half circle, and then you take off the free triangle.
Take off the triangles?
Yeah.
So let's say here's the area of a half circle and a circle area. Hopefully you recall, pi r squared. And half of that would give us the semicircular area there. I think that would get us a good start. As for the triangles, we'd have to find the area of a triangle, I think, to do that too. And what are the other assumptions might we have to make in order to finish it? We have a pretty good direction on it, I think, already. What other assumptions might need to be made to fine-tune it?
C'est comique là.
The area of a triangle formula, I imagine some of you remember it from high school or before. Bad memories, perhaps. You can say it en français as well, if you wish.
La question c'est comment on fait le lien du triangle, c'est ça? J'ai oublié. I don't remember.
He's forgotten. And so I heard that mean we have a half in there. I'm not sure in français what the notation is. In English we usually say base or base, and then the height or maybe elevation. I'm not sure the French word. But I think with those formulas, we'd probably be able to solve it and find that area, which was not a problem that I prepared beforehand. I avoided thinking about it too much, and what we might solve or what we might do here to start. But I think with the combination of these pieces and your suggestion, I think we could probably solve and find that area there. I think it would be possible, although I'm not sure what the answer is. And I introduce it this way, I begin this way because I'm recalling the words of Ellul. The free man is a man who takes risks. He was always in a new situation, and I felt it incumbent to begin with a risk or to begin with an open-ended question, which I don't even know the answer to, but I think is possible to solve, although I'm not sure. I do thank you for indulging me in that situation, that experiment, which was perhaps a fright for you and for me, but I think that is good. It's similar to an experiment that I've used at times in my classroom to begin a semester or to begin a unit of study, and I find that such things help transform my classroom from one that's strangled by technique to one that opens up paths to freedom. And despite the fact that technique is becoming ever more pervasive in schooling, I'm committed that there are still ways to teach outside of its dominance. It may not be necessary to convince you that public schooling, especially U.S. public schooling where I'm situated, is moving ever further under the sway of technique. Teachers, students, and administrators alike find themselves moving ever further, ringed about with a band of steel, to borrow Ellul's words from Technological Society. In that work, he included some descriptions and predictions about technique and education. Many of those have come true. And it certainly seems that most of the students that I encounter are being educated to be technicians for that primary purpose.
Excuse me, could you just step a bit far
Sure.
away from the microphone?
Better?
It's very loud. Just get farther.
Better?
Yeah, like that.
Okay. Thank you. I appreciate the feedback. For many of the students, the after school year means relentless testing, force feeding of new gadgets and technologies in a very regimented environment. Technique dictates, as Ellul said, social confirmation must be impressed upon the child. He must be adapted to society. He must not impair its development. Teachers are also turned into technicians, and as Ellul pointed out, literally anyone can do the job if he is trained to do it. For those who don't have a window into public schooling right now, I have one terrifying example to share, and more examples later if you'd like to hear them. There was a seasoned, really capable elementary teacher I know. She was teaching 10-year-olds in an American primary school, public school. And it was a charter school. Her first 6 weeks in the job, she said every day there was an administrator in her classroom observing her behavior every day for 6 weeks, watching what she was doing. And after 6 weeks, the administrator, the school principal said, today we're going to begin real-time feedback. And I asked what that was. She said they forced her to put an earpiece in while she was teaching. And during her lecture, during her interaction with the students, the principal sat in the back of the room and gave her instructions as to what to do next and how she might approach the lesson while she was teaching through her earpiece, which was very disturbing to me. I was wondering if they didn't hire robots yet, but I also want to be careful not to give them any ideas. So my thesis here is not that technique is infiltrating and dominating schools, but that it is possible to teach outside of the grip of technique. And even with all the testing gadgets, curriculum, standardization, there's still freedom in the classroom that is possible. And it's also worth pointing out that the traditional classroom may not be the preferred setting for that, but it's where I find myself and where some of us find ourselves. I first saw an example of that sort of teaching outside of technique, a different way of being. When I was 14, I was coming into my first day of high school, first period in a geometry classroom, and the teacher, this is in Wheaton, Illinois, the teacher had no preamble, no introduction, no policies, no books. He just began with, someone write an equation, any equation up on the board. And a student came up and wrote a squared plus b squared equals c squared. And the teacher said, oh, that's a very special equation. Now who else can give me the picture that goes with that equation? Another student came up and drew a right triangle, and right from the beginning, the teacher proposed a problem, and then a student suggested a solution. The teacher went to the back, and the student was sent to the front, and the student worked and solved for a couple minutes, and then as her solution was finished, she looked back at the teacher, who said nothing, and then all of us looked back at the teacher, who said nothing, and after a moment he said, why are you all looking at me? You're the ones with the sharp minds. You tell her if her solution is valid. You tell her if she's doing it right. You give her a critique of what she's doing. And in doing that, in the very first 3-4 minutes of the class, he was not telling us, but showing us that we were steering the class, that we were doing so as part of a larger dialogue that wasn't solely determined by the instructor. And this wasn't merely an act, it wasn't a gimmick. Over the years, as his students had suggested new lines of inquiry or suggested a unique solution, at least 20 times he shepherded his students toward publishing their work in mathematics journals as high school students. And to me, in the words of Ellul, this is a teacher who's an example of one who opens up freedom for us, who lets us make our own history, who goes with us on the more or less unheard of adventures that we concoct. And on some days, this teacher would drop everything that was planned in order to pursue a student's inquiry into some geometric topic. If you have any idea what's happening in public schools, you might be troubled, but I sometimes wonder if there's any way for freedom still, but that teacher in the back of my mind presents an example and a pole star showing that it is possible to inculcate freedom in the classroom. In the 2012 Ellul conference, I found myself asking another presenter, what could all of this look like in a classroom? And later I prepared this paper and my presentation, realized that I had found some of the answers and I've seen some of the answers to that, but I also hope to gain more, perhaps even from those of you who were present in Ellul's classroom or his educational settings and who are familiar with that personally. I've ventured to try some of these things in my classroom and given a lot of thought to what it might look like. And so my focus today is, what are the hallmarks of a classroom not dominated by technique, and what could freedom in the classroom look like? I'm not able to present a fully formed picture of the classroom, some technique, and I'm not trying to present a system or a program which would itself merely become another technique. Instead, I'd like to delineate some characteristics of the classroom that can be catalysts for freedom, or must be present for freedom to exist, if technique is not to be the driving force. For those who are reading this later or weren't present for this experiment, I hope that you're able to discern some of these elements in my descriptions of my instructor. In both the experiment we were attempting here and in my instructor's classroom, the end and the means were the same. In that Wheaton classroom described above, from the very start, the teacher was living out that way of being, the very way of being that he wanted his students to enter into. A few short minutes into the school year, they began to participate in this state. The end goal was a curious, rigorous, dialogic interaction with the measurement and description of the physical world, and the method by which he was achieving this goal and the students were approaching this goal was the same. I find this unity of the end and the means to be prerequisite for freedom in the classroom. The next catalyst that I've experienced is risk. In the Ethics of Freedom, as I mentioned before, Ellul wrote that the free man is a man who takes risks. He goes forward without guarantees. He is always in a new situation. I've learned through failure and success in my own classroom that the way of freedom can only be paved with risk, and usually that means I go first as a teacher. I'm convinced that without modeling this, without doing it from the very first minutes of instruction, freedom will be squashed. On different occasions, I've ventured to start a semester of geometry or physics with the question like, can you draw me a picture involving the number 8? Or on these blank axes, would you draw me any graph that you'd like? The risk is very palpable, and I can confirm that it was very frightening. At other times, I've attempted a false freedom in which I elicit student suggestions and curriculum ideas, only then to force the students into the curriculum which I've already decided on beforehand. And the students, I believe, can sense that I'm bluffing. They can sense also that I'm actually taking a risk. And only a true step of faith, genuinely desiring and then pursuing student freedom, can foster that relationship of freedom. Such risks that the instructor takes will often spur on healthy risks by the students. It's no small matter for students to suggest a new course of study, or to try a new or difficult problem, or to defend the validity of their work. Bravery is required of them as well. The next catalyst that I've observed in the presence of trust is the presence of trust in the classroom. First, I must trust that students have worthwhile questions to ask. And second, students must trust that their ideas, their answers, and their identities will be respected. 2 years ago, I began a physics class with a blank graph, and this led to a student-created plot of energy versus height. And a student in that class eventually asked the question, how much energy would it take to hit a home run in baseball? And that investigation, which I'd never considered before, led and it turns up all sorts of interesting results. As it turns out, if you'd like to know, a home run in baseball requires a tiny amount of energy, of calories or joules, less than the food calories stored in a single M&M candy, for perspective. Another time, when I presented students with a summary of topics for second semester in physics, they asked, well, can we break a wine glass with our voice? And inwardly, I was quite skeptical, but I agreed to the pursuit of breaking a wine glass with our voices. And that risk paid off. I learned that I myself can break a wine glass with my non-professional singing voice. I trusted students to engage, and they reciprocated by trusting me with their ideas and suggestions. You'll be sad to know that I have my singing voice here, but I didn't bring a wine glass, or perhaps you'd be happy to hear that. Another important catalyst is humility. I certainly cannot claim to have mastered this one. I know that I must restrain my inclination to know it all. In my observations and experience, some of the best learning comes when the teacher says, I don't know, to a student question. My usual instinct, when I asked if we could break wine glasses, was to say, that won't work because, but I'm thankful that I didn't say it. Swallowing my own belief that I knew what was possible was one of the best and most important steps that I took. A final catalyst, which I wish to emphasize, is dialogue. Only with dialogue can learners have any true freedom. In dialogue, the elements of risk, trust, and humility find their expression. I do not know what students will ask or suggest on the first day or any day of class. For our dialogue to have any value, there must be the ever-present possibility, nay, likelihood, that our dialogue and our learning will veer off into the unknown. That is one more reason why I began this presentation with an open-ended experiment, as did the teacher I described above. Risk and uncertainty are inherent in dialogue. The monologue of a lecture, which I'm also prone to using, like right now, the monologue of a lecture does seem to stamp out those uncertainties and the corresponding freedom they can create. The most vibrant classrooms that I have ever seen were marked with a flourishing dialogue between teacher and student, and amongst the students too. When they're in dialogue with each other and with the subject matter at hand, true freedom can be present. I have been nourished here by the words of Paulo Freire. Dialogue is the encounter between men mediated by the world in order to name the world. In a geometry or a science classroom, and many others, certainly much of the task at hand begins with naming the world. One of the things I hope for is described by Ellul in The Presence of the Kingdom. Communication transcends technique because it can only take place where two human beings are fully engaged in a real conversation. In my own experiments, opening the classroom to dialogue led to all manner of new pursuits. Many of the questions students raised were ones that I did not have the answers to. This made it all the more exciting and risky. We spent time in the baseball field experimenting with their home run question. I learned that even a novice like myself can break a wine glass with their voice using the proper principles. Student questions led to observing a guitar string under a strobe light, and another experiment to maximize the number of circular pancakes that would fit on a griddle on the stove. When a true dialogue is established, the adventures it produces could lead one anywhere. I'll conclude by stating that this is all a work in progress, that I'm still learning about and growing, not a finished achievement. If freedom can exist in a classroom, it must be continually established and reestablished. My own most recent attempts to establish such a context began about 2 years ago in one of my high school physics classes. I rejoiced in the successes, the new experiments described above, but I was also reminded of the level of attention and creativity that's required of the students and the teacher alike. That particular experiment was forcibly stopped by the pandemic in March 2020, but I continue to think about what freedom might look like in the classroom. I welcome your input and comments, especially those who have personal familiarity with Ellul and his work. For a start, I'd be happy to hear some ideas of what one might call call this practice. A classroom opposed to technique doesn't sound right, and the term free classroom is quite vague. So I'm interested in nomenclature, if you have suggestions. I'm also interested in how others have experienced or practiced Ellul's thought and action in the classroom. I recognize that many times my own teaching has veered toward propaganda, and I'm moving towards the possibility of that simple dialogue that Ellul describes. With that in mind, I welcome your comments here and correspondence later. Thank you.